the Afrikaner of South Africa, the Boer War. This short summary of their history comes from the book, The Vigilantes of Christendom, by Richard Kelly Hoskins, 1990. The subtitle of this book is The Story of the Phineas Priesthood. Phineas being a historical figure in the Bible, a man who loved his people, the Israel people of the Bible. This is the chapter on South Africa, the last half of that chapter, entitled The Boer War. A link to this free book is in the description below. Begin on page 274 of this online book. The first half of this chapter, click on my picture, here on YouTube. Listen to the audio called The Afrikaners, a historical summary, first 240 years. On the back, this book is written by Mr. Hoskins. Japanese kamikazes who die for their faith are worshipped as gods. Shiite Muslims who die enforcing the laws of Allah receive the acclaim of Islam and instant entry into paradise. Jews honor militant Zionists who enforce Jewish law with national recognition and by making them leaders of the state. Phineas priests who enforce Christian laws are sentenced to prison of death. Dutch settlers first arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa in 1652. It was a vacant land then. In Dutch, Boer means farmer. For centuries, the English government, the big money interest behind that nation, wanted all the natural wealth in South Africa. Thus, the term Boer War means English government makes war against the Afrikaner farmer. I would ask that after listening to this summary of the Afrikaners in South Africa, you click on the link I have put in the description, a link to this book free to you, and read the charts I have not put in full in this audit. There is probably not a more persecuted group of people the past 400 years than the white folks living in South Africa, who call themselves the Afrikaners. As you listen to this, I would ask that you think about modern America, Europe, Australia, Western civilization, and see if you can see the same actions, a sameness being taken against modern white nations, the same assault using people of color to destroy us. Then when the irreversible damage is done, the psychopaths seizing all properties of value for themselves. It is a genetic trait with psychopaths, often passed to their children. Boer War by Richard Kelly Hoskins. When I was a youngster, an elderly retired British major moved to town. He was tall, stately, with a closely clipped mustache. He had married one of our gracefully aging Virginia belles and had come to live in Lynchburg, where she had kin. He bought Monkeyville, a wooded tract containing old war between the state's trenches where generations of Virginia boys played war. He leveled the trenches and built a fine house, which had a lead water fountain in front dated 1741. The house looked like a French chateau. He named it 7 Pines. The boys hated to see the trenches go, but the house that replaced them included magnificent formal gardens, hidden pools with wonderfully large gold fish, and a fine swimming pool with figures, flowers, and more fountains. I was impressed. He courteously invited many Lynchburg residents to use his swimming pool. My family was included. The white-haired major with his clipped mustache was a very congenial sort, but there were 2 subjects he would never discuss: Virginia's favorite subject, genealogy, and the Boer War. I have since discovered the reason for the reluctance of the British upper classes to discuss their ancestry. We know precisely which of our ancestors hold claim to the titles and lands they presently possess, and their reluctance to discuss the subject often borders on rudeness. This gentleman was well connected in Britain and had been a major in the British Army serving in South Africa during the Boer War. He hated the Boers. When a youngster, I had an interest in military history and tried to get him to talk about his experiences. He would start a story, get red in the face, stand up and stalk off with such an expression on his face that one dared not broach the subject again. I couldn't understand it. Many years later, after studying what had happened to the British Army in South Africa, I understood his reaction. A handful of Boer farmers had done the unforgivable. They had beaten the socks off the finest regiments in the British Army and had humiliated the entire British Empire. Starting on page 575 of The Boer Fight for Freedom, Michael Davitt, Funk and Wagnall's N.Y. 1902, are tables that should be examined before any other detail of the war is examined. They explain everything: the total British forces employed in the war and the casualties suffered by them up to the 1st of January 1902 are given as follows. In British official reports, these statistics tell a story that has long been suppressed. The powers who ruled Britain wanted the Boer gold fields. To get the gold fields, they needed to subjugate the Boers. They used the British Empire to defeat the Boers and get to the gold mines. The following is how it was done: active fighting. The Boer War was divided into two parts. At first, the Boers met the British toe-to-toe wherever they chose and inflicted unbelievable casualties on them. Battles in which odds were between 3-1 and 6-1 were commonplace. When the Boers were outnumbered only 2-1, they figured that they held victory in their hand and went right after the British. With few exceptions, the Boer War was one long, humiliating military disaster for the British. British troops employed in South Africa to fight against the farmers were 388,749. Note to the listener, I have omitted the detail of these charts, which are interesting. Go to the link in the description for a free online book. Start on page 274 for that detail. By the end of this war of the big money English against the Afrikaner farmers, English army casualties were 115,459, 30% of their forces. The Boer forces and losses figure out as follows. The English, having made war on the whole Boer nation, men, women, and children, the entire Boer population of the two little republics, would represent the army opposed to the 388,000 English troops. The Boer population of the Transvaal and Free State in 1899 is not accurately known. The general estimates were 232,000, men, women, and children. I estimate the casualties of the Boer armies up to December 31, 1901 as follows. Afrikaners killed in the field, 3,000. Afrikaners died of wounds and sickness, 2,000. Children killed in the concentration camps, 14,000. Men, women, and children imprisoned in the concentration camps, 120,000. In the second part, the British armies had grown so large that there was no way the small Boer armies could meet them in formal battle. The Boers broke up into small commando units and scattered, waging hit-and-run war. The British retaliated by burning everything above ground that belonged to the Boers and taking hostage their women and children and putting them into vast concentration camps where they were fed bad food and water. The children died like flies. Over 20,000 women and children died in these camps. The British killed far more Boers in these camps than they were able to kill on the battlefield. The threat was that if the Boers did not stop fighting, all their women and children would be allowed to die. This, in the end, forced the Boers to make peace to avoid the complete extermination of their people. War instructions to burghers. Burghers means Afrikaners. General Joubert of the Boer Army issued instructions to officers and men regarding their conduct while in British territory. When we are unwillingly compelled to cross the borderline of our country, let it not be thought or said that we are a band of robbers. And with that view, let us remain as far as possible away from any private dwellings or places where no enemy is stationed, and not allow each one to help himself. When ford, forage, or cattle are needed, let 1 or 2 persons be appointed in each division, and let them be assisted by as many men, and if necessary, officers, as may be required to acquire such goods from the owner or caretaker. Enter them upon a proper list, and if desired, let a receipt be given for the same, with a promise of recompense by the government. I will not allow robbery or plunder, and forbid any personal injury to be done to any private individual. P.J. Joubert, Commandant General, Magersfontein Battle. There are many British South African encounters from which to choose. The result of one is practically the same as the next. At the Battle of Magersfontein, British forces containing the Highland Brigade, the Lancers, Australian and Canadian Volunteers, the Guards, Black Watch, and other Highland regiments comprising about 14,000 men with 38 field pieces, were faced by 5,000 burghers, Afrikaners, with 3 field pieces. The preliminary British artillery attack to soften up the Boer defenses lasted 2 days, during which 3 Boers were killed and 6 wounded. No return shots were fired by the Boer artillery. The British infantry attacked through a morning mist. The mist lifted, exposing the attacking force, and the fate of the Black Watch and their general was sealed, as Boer sharpshooters unerringly began their grisly work. Also decimated were the Highland Light Infantry, the Argylls, Seaforths, and Sutherlands. In half a minute, over 700 Highlanders fell. The Boer chronicler commented, "Pity it was that Celtic blood should have paid so dear a penalty for so ignoble a cause, and that men from Highland glens and isles, sons of once liberty-loving clans, should be the fallen foemen." The South Africans lost 71 killed and 165 wounded. The English losses approached 1,500. Embarrassing losses were often fudged by reporting them piecemeal over a long time period. The Highland Brigade alone left 700 on the field. The Black Watch alone lost 300 men and 20 officers. The London Standard, in a rare unbiased article, stated, "The enemy behaved with great courtesy. They had given water to our wounded of the Highland Brigade. He further offered 50 burghers to help to bury our dead." Nicholson's Kop battle Colonel Carleton of the British Army occupied Nicholson's Kop with 2 regiments. General Christian de Wet and 250 men climbed to shoot them off. Boer casualties, 16 killed, 55 wounded. British casualties, 63 men killed, 249 wounded, 954 prisoners. Total 1,266 casualties, with a battery of mountain guns captured. After the battle, Boers carried water up from the valley to the English wounded on the mountain. There was no show of triumph over beaten foes. Spion Kop battle Spion Kap was a commanding hill taken by a night attack by 3,000 British from 16 Afrikaner defenders of the Vryheid Commando. The Carolina Commando sent up 90 men to drive them away. Later, more reinforcements were scraped up and sent to the hill until a total of 600 burghers, Afrikaners, were in the fight. The battle lasted for 14 hours before the British retreated. South African losses were 50 killed and 120 wounded. Total British losses in killed, wounded, and prisoners were 1,500, with 400 being killed. A story is told of an old burgher, age 70, accompanied by his grandson, a boy of 14. No other Mauser on Spion Kap dealt out a more steady and effective fire during the carnage of the 24th than that of Piet. "One more Rooinek down, Grandpapa." Finally, Compiet's bandolier was emptied of its cartridges, and no other supply was at hand. Outside the entrenchments lay a burgher who had been shot. The boy, vaulted over the boulders, possessed himself of the dead burgher's bandolier, and sprang back with the ammunition. On the dead being counted the following day, the old man and his grandson were found among the slain, lying side by side. Warriors' Hymn before Battle of Colenso. There were 23,000 Britishers forming up in the morning preparing for battle. Less than 5,000 burghers, Afrikaners, opposed them. Suddenly there came from the Boer positions a deep volume of thrilling sound, rolling, as it were, like peals of muffled thunder down from the hills on towards the river. It was the morning hymn of the Boer camp, the invocation of divine help for the cause of land and volk, sung by the older burghers as, rifle in hand, and hearts and minds set on victory, they stood ready. On the Britishers came the Fusiliers and Connaught Rangers in front, and the Border Regiment and Ellenus Killings behind. Not a soul was to be seen in front. The Boers patiently waited until the enemy got too close to get away. General Botha's report to President Kruger stated simply, "The God of our fathers has today granted us a brilliant victory. We opened fire upon them with our Mauser musketry, and killed their cannon service and captured 10 big, beautiful cannons, together with 12 ammunition wagons. We have also made prisoners of war of about 170 of their best men, who stormed us so pluckily time after time. The enemy's loss is terrible, Their dead are lying upon each other, and I think the British loss must have been 2,000 men. Our loss is confined to about 30 killed and wounded. Guerrilla warfare, the last stage. The British Army grew into a steamroller of 250,000 men. It was just too big to fight toe-to-toe. There were only perhaps 15,000 Boer commandos. The decision was made to disperse and continue the war with hit-and-run tactics. The British retaliated with scorched earth tactics, brutality toward prisoners, and summary executions. Farms, buildings, and crops were burned. In places, everything above ground that could burn was burned. They punished the civilian population by herding them into concentration camps where many died. Empire generals boast much of their military sweeps. Entire armies were spaced at arm's-length distance in lines that stretched for miles and miles and marched across the countryside. Behind the sweep line rode highly mobile troops who immediately attacked the quarry that the sweep line flushed. In practice, the sweeps had some success, but the Boers mostly evaded them and continued their successes right down to the final capitulation. The only land the British Army could really call its own was the land that they were standing on. All else belonged to the handful of Boer commandos in the field. As the war progressed, the Boers were forced to take greater and greater risks to achieve the same results. It is interesting to speculate on what would have been the outcome of the conflict if the Boers had detailed a small fraction of those they lost in action to special missions outside the combat arena, against specific military, economic, and propaganda media targets on the scale that is presently planned or actually done by, say, the Soviet Spetsnaz or the Israeli Mossad. While the Boers quickly learned about soldiers, cannon, supplies, and the terror of the torch, those were only combat techniques of the soldiers they were fighting. They had no real comprehension of the deeper type of warfare being waged against them by those who directed the soldiers. The simple missions actually undertaken against traitors behind British lines were almost 100% effective, but nothing was undertaken against these other less vulnerable but more important targets. Conclusion by a Boer. The following heart-rending words, written in the middle of the Boer War, are those of an Afrikaner patriot crying for someone to listen, to understand. It is the cry of someone whose land was being brutalized, a cry that echoes down over the years. The world looks on, the civilized Christian world of churches and of preachers of the gospel, at this barbarous spectacle in South Africa, with about as much real indignation as if Lord Kitchener and his 220,000 troops were inflicting all the horrors of British warfare upon a commonwealth of criminals or brigands, and not upon two little republics made up of one of the bravest races in Europe, and of the most intensely and sincerely Christian people on earth. England has killed 14,000 Christian children, has imprisoned 45,000 Christian women in barbed wire enclosures, has devastated two Christian countries where there was less poverty and less vice than in any other Christian community in the world, and had armed savages to help her. And yet Cardinal Vaughan, in the name of the Catholic Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury in behalf of the Protestants, and the nonconformists of the same enlightened Christian nation, piously call down God's blessing upon the arms which are killing and exterminating a little Christian nation in South Africa. And the United States, Austria, and other countries, equally Christian, enlightened and humane, sell supplies to the power which wages such a war. The explanation of this moral standard of the day is not hard to seek. England, by her money markets and press and commerce, by her pulpit and parliament, by her rationalistic missionaries, her newspapers, and the influence of her wealth, has morally debased Christianity, and has enthroned the creed of human cupidity in the temple, out of which the gentle Savior of Nazareth, with his gospel of love and of justice and humanity, once banished the money changers. This is why cardinals and archbishops, papers and stock exchanges, politicians and cabinets, look on as unmoved at the horrors of the concentration camps as the Herodian high priests probably did at the measures which carried out the wholesale murder of the Judean children of 1900 years ago. It also explains why a United States, a France, and a Germany continue, at least in their governments, as passive spectators of the most dishonorable and unchristian war which has ever disgraced a civilized age. The enemy media, far more important than the tremendous British armies, was the establishment media. The Boers constantly complained of the way they were being treated. Such things as the following appear in their writings. This little state has been hounded down by its English enemies in the press of England and America. In another place, the crusade of lies carried on by the capitalist newspapers was in no way justified by the actual facts. Afrikaners confusing freedom of the press and with giving license to an alien apparatus to teach murder, rape, plunder, and annihilation, and not knowing to establish a central information clearing office to guard and defend against the plague spread by this media, were helpless before the world media colossus, far more powerful and deadly than the British Army. The media were the reasons the army was there. The media were the reasons the British soldiers committed the atrocities. The media were the whips the international bankers used to rule the Christian British public. Thomas Jefferson complained about the media. Andy Jackson condemned it. Its power was monstrous. People only know what they read or are told. They can know nothing else. Based on this, they attempt to act righteously to ensure justice. Most, if given truth, act justly. If people are made to believe a lie, and believing a lie they act to harm someone, they have been presented with a stumbling block, and the law, God's law, condemns the liar. In a Christian nation, the juries punish such offenders, and the government keeps watch to see that such things do not occur. The South Africans complained that the grievances, thus manufactured by a subsidized press, were as much a part of the war as bullets and cannon. They did not realize that the press was not only subsidized, it was most often owned or controlled outright from abroad. It printed whatever it needed to gain the gold mines. If it was necessary to lie about miners' grievances, they lied. They alone selected the source to speak for the South Africans. If that South African source were composed of their own creatures in their pay, and if war followed because of it, and thousands of men, women, and children died, that was the price paid for doing a good job. That too was all right. After all, war was good for the economy back home. The gold mines were an additional prize, and they were just doing their job. The press and its owners, by their actions, had put themselves into the front lines where bullets fly, blood is spilt, and young lives are snuffed out by their false witnesses. Then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother, and thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life. The hirelings of the press cold-bloodedly manufactured another war which murdered thousands. It was only the inability of the Boers to recognize this form of warfare that prevented them from retaliating by hunting down to a man the writers and owners responsible, a thing which could have easily been done. To condition the people of England, Australia, Canada, Scotland, and Ireland for the war, and to condition them to furnish needed soldiers, the most outrageous atrocity stories were manufactured about South Africans. South Africans noted that they had to contend with the uniform silence of the Cape and English press on every incident or act which has conspicuously belied the unjust estimate of the Boer by his implacable enemy. Mr. Hoskins then quotes Bible passages. If a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then shall ye do unto him, as he had thought to have done unto his brother. And those which remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil among you. And thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Deuteronomy 19:16. 21. It has been the same through the ages. At the time of the Maccabees, the government was in the hands of Greek strangers and alien law governed. This forced the people, in Phineas fashion, to govern and dispense punishment to evildoers. The results of the fictitious media atrocity stories had predictable results. Following is a case in point. A nephew of General Joubert's entered a shed from whence sounds of pain came from a party of wounded British. He overheard one of the wounded say in tones of fear, "May God have mercy on us, here they come. They will cut our throats." "Oh no, we won't," instantly responded Mr. Joubert. "We are Christians like yourselves, and you will be treated just as kindly as our own wounded." Boers were believed to be a compound of uneducated Dutchmen and of savage Kaffir, a treacherous, inhuman foeman, dead to all the better feelings of civilized soldiers, unkempt, cruel, and rapacious. Great and agreeable, therefore, was the astonishment of the British prisoners and wounded, with the maligned Boer. They found him the very reverse of the picture which the slanderers in the Cape and London press had drawn of the people whose country was to be ruthlessly despoiled. The media had filled the British with lies in their effort to arouse public support for plundering the South African gold mines. As a consequence, many British soldiers thought nothing of shooting defenseless prisoners or entering dwellings and robbing and even beating South African families. The feeling had been foisted that whatever punishment meted out to the evil South Africans was not half what they deserved. The media-aroused British Army went so far as to issue its soldiers Mark IV ammunition, dum-dum bullets, bullets manufactured to expand on hitting human flesh, and which inflict dreadful wounds. The media were responsible for this state of mind among the military. The Liverpool Daily Post printed the following letter from one of the British soldiers at the front. "Many of our soldiers are quite rich with the loot that has fallen to them. The infantry regiments profited to the largest extent. Our boys are parading about now with gold watches, chains, and other trinkets." The spirit which prompted such unsoldierly conduct was the result of the calumnies circulated in the Rhodesian and Jingo press. This letter was printed without a mention of the law, which forbids such conduct. The British public and the recruits going into the British Army were taught that despoiling Christian prisoners and Christian dead was acceptable behavior. Another media falsehood. The uninitiated did not comprehend the power of the usury kings who rule with their press. Their wealth is large. It was gotten by means God declares to be fraudulent. This wealth is not measured in millions, hundreds of millions, or even a billion, but in tens and hundreds of billions. There are scores of these money barons who can, if they wish, buy companies like Chrysler Corporation, American Electric Power, or American Telephone as easily as a Boer could buy a wagon. The international bankers learned in 1290 that invisibility is their protection. Their usury gives them the power to impose debt on borrowers. Debt reduces the borrowers to slaves. The borrower is slave. Slaves do the will of their masters. The usurers had growing multitudes of slaves required to do their will. Such rulers are powerful. They live unseen. Some live on vast estates having hundreds of retainers, airports, golf courses, and private armies of bodyguards. Their yachts rival anything seen by heads of state. But their owners are seldom photographed by their media. Their papers overlook them. They are invisible. We catch a glimpse when their overseers momentarily step into the limelight to bid $5 billion or $10 billion to add to their collection of corporations. $1 billion is 1,000 millions. 10 billion is 10,000 millions. A one-time expenditure of 5% of this amount, or just $500 million, would buy control of any state in the U.S. The same expenditure made each year would deliver control of most countries. There are hidden individuals who own 10 times 10 billion and control 10 times that, or trillions of dollars. We see them once in a while when we are stopped by police to allow their cavalcades to roar past, or when a private plane lands and is immediately surrounded by bodyguards, or when a mysterious $50 million yacht drops anchor, or when the occasional mysterious meeting is held in the dead of night on a Virginia mountaintop, seen and talked about by the locals. They are there. Sometimes a glimpse of the illustrious is not all that exotic. While attending law school at William and Mary, I worked as usher and ticket collector at the local movie house and had the opportunity to meet one of usury's major practitioners, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. On occasion, he came to see a movie. Receiving word a few minutes before the show started, I would clear a few grumbling moviegoers from the back row to make room for him. Since he owned the theater, that seemed reasonable enough. After everyone was seated and the show was ready to start, Rockefeller's little party arrived and slipped into their seats. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. was a thin, well-dressed, polite, nice-looking, elderly man of medium height. He had one or two attendants to whom I never had time to give a second thought. They sat on the same row with him. I supposed that he had gotten tired of looking at four walls somewhere and had to get out among people. I was probably right. He could have watched the movie at home if that is all that he had wanted to do. This is what John Zero Jr. looked like. He looked like anyone else. The entire time I was in Williamsburg, I never saw his name in the paper, or his activities or opinions discussed by the media. Seldom seen, he appeared suddenly and disappeared just as fast, but his presence hung over everything. He, or technically his foundation, owned colonial Williamsburg. Everyone there worked for the man. This knowledge is not secret if one knows where to look. In Williamsburg, it was a fact of life seldom discussed, but who looks in Williamsburg, especially when there is no limelight to guide? In other places and other times, a little more digging is needed to uncover what is not discussed by the media. It becomes easier to follow the trail when sometimes they quietly boast among themselves, especially those things that happened in former years after the dust of time has covered most tracks. A few quotes illustrate. In 1593, Marranos arrived in Amsterdam after having been refused admission to Middelburg and Haarlem. They became strenuous supporters of the House of Orange and were in return protected by the stadholder. Encyclopedia Britannica, 14th Edekers, Netherlands, pagina 228. William Ill employed Jews in his negotiations with foreign kings. Isaac Lopez Suasso, who lent 2 million gulden to William Ill for his descent upon England. Jewish Encyclopedia, Netherlands, page 230. When William Ill went to England to assume the British throne, Isaac Lopez Suasso granted him a long-term loan of 2 million gulden without interest. Univers Jewish Ency, Holland, pagina 432. Those who see with eyes sharpened by Christian law know that the borrower is slave to the lender. Puer 22:7. Through their slaves, the lenders first ruled Holland, then Britain. The Britons that the South Africans fought were serfs, not hereditary foes. They were doing what serfs do when they are ordered to do it. The wealthy rulers had others to execute their wishes. To crush the Boers, the blacks were organized along with the armed might of the British Empire. Australia, Canada were represented. India sent troops. Had it been necessary, Germany and the United States would have been ordered to send their battalions, and they would have sent them. The establishment media in those countries obediently castigated the South Africans. All that the suffering and agony of the South African men, women, and children proved was that a man who is a free king and priest is a better warrior than a serf. Christians already knew that. The Boers of South Africa bled themselves white, defending themselves against hired hands, and never once struck a blow against those who caused the violations of God's laws. The invading soldiers they killed were landless hired mercenaries. They were their own cousins, their own flesh and blood. Those who caused the war now owned South Africa's gold and enjoyed the planes, yachts, corporations, and estates it bought, while remaining invisible behind their paper curtain. State religion. There are those who obey God's law and those who don't. Those who obey are the lawful. Those who disobey are outlawed by God. God has specified the outlaw's punishment. Phineas priests enforce the law, and God rewards them with a covenant of an everlasting priesthood. The atrocity committed against South Africa was instigated by the establishment, fanned by the media, and approved by the state religion. False witnesses assured the world that the crimes committed were approved by God. South Africa was damned by them, and its people were earmarked for death. In the Boer War, the media and the state church were very visible. They relied on their victims' unsophisticated reactions to work their schemes, smoothing the way for the establishment to bring about the South African Holocaust. In defending themselves, the Boers called on the Lord, but forgot to listen to his words. They were so intent on the invader at hand that they neglected to watch those directing him. What did they forget? Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. Proverbs 18:21. If a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. And those which remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil among you. And thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Deuteronomy 19:16-21. Hath given forth upon usury, he shall surely die, his blood shall be upon him. Ezekiel 18:13. The day will inevitably come when the sufferings of long, bloody conflicts will teach a more successful mode of warfare. The Indians in Virginia almost annihilated the colony until the white man copied their concept of total war and used it against them. In South Africa, the financiers and their media could not be met on their own ground, and they were not forced onto the battlefield. South African writers have voiced the opinion that 10 Boers in Cape Town and 5 in London could have accomplished more than 15,000 of their fellows on the veldt.